Hello, everyone. Okay, we need a little audience participation here just to keep us started. This is the last session of the afternoon before you get an opportunity to have a cocktail, so I'll try to make it as exciting as possible. Let me first introduce the topic and then this esteemed panel. As our program states, ultimately it is people, not institutions, who will drive inclusive progress. A mindset shift is needed across business and civil society, government, as well as media in order to reorient our economies and societies to a path of inclusive progress. But how we facilitate these changes in our personal and professional and political lives are what we're going to be discussing here today. It's been said that, quote, urgent and concerted effort is needed from governments, people, and institutions to drive more inclusive, sustainable economic and societal growth that benefits everyone in society. And I'm joined today by some learned minds in this area. To my immediate left is Luvvie Ajayi. Did I say it correctly? Sure, you did. Yes. Who is a phenomenal speaker and author on this topic and many others, as well as a great blogger that I am very much committed to reading. To my far left is Ranya Shamoon, correct? Wonderful, who is Vice President of Baby Care, and you may remember from last year if you were here, she was then in charge of feminine care for Europe P&G. To my far right is Michael Kaufman, founder of White Ribbon Campaign. And to my immediate right is Alexis McGill Johnson, Executive Director, Perception Institute. Let's give them a round of applause. So let's jump right in. Luvvie, I want to get started with you. Okay, in order for us to open hearts and close divides, one must first acknowledge that your heart is closed and a divide exists. How do we get comfortable with the notion that we're kind of screwed up and we need some help?
Well, the cool thing to know is everybody's screwed up, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just, we're not just standing on islands by ourselves. And the first whole thing about you have to admit what the problem is before you can solve it. A lot of times people don't want to admit that they're hustling backwards, is what I like to say. Governments and businesses and these major organizations can figure out space travel and artificial intelligence, but can't seem to figure out inclusivity, like in diversity. That always perplexes me. Like, you figured out outer space, but you're like, I don't know how to retain my black employees. And I'm like, how is that? One, we need to admit that it's okay that we are different. Because I think sometimes people use the crutch of, well, I don't see the difference in any of us. No, we're different. Our difference should be celebrated. And, you know, I don't ever want anybody for me to walk in a room and people be like, I definitely don't see her color. No, you might be able to see my color, but then what's most important is that you see the value that I bring in the room more than anything else. And my color does not really have anything to do with that. So when we talk about inclusive environments and how do we build these things, understanding that, one, admitting that piece, pointing out somebody's color is not inherently bad. What happens is that difference, what do you do with it?
Making a comment about a racial fact does not mean you are a racist.
Correct. When people are like, oh my God, you said white people, that makes you racist. What? How? I think we need to, one, understand and also teach each other what it actually means, what race means, what diversity means. And it's not a quota system, it's not tokenization. And oftentimes the conversation is reduced to this stuff. So when we're talking about getting uncomfortable, it's being comfortable with having the real conversations, the real nuances about being inclusive. You know, creating environments in your business where people don't automatically get penalized for their color because, you know, people like me have to include compliment sandwiches in our emails. You know a compliment sandwich? Let me explain what a compliment sandwich is. Hey, Star, I love your shoes. I need the report at 5 o'clock. Your hair is banging today. Because if I didn't include those top two things, people might be like, oh my God, Star, could I get the project at 5 p.m.? Oh my God, she was short with me. So when we show up at work, we also have to show up and play this politics and this game. And it makes it difficult to do and be the best version of yourself when you're constantly being like, will this version of myself that shows up be considered aggressive or short just because it looks like this? So until companies are willing to really be like, you know what have we fostered in our environment that pushes this forward, nothing's gonna get done. And the discomfort of calling something out in a room, you know how we talk about like teenagers and little kids get peer pressured into certain things? Adults also need to get peer pressured into certain things, like telling the truth and being straightforward and being direct in meetings. Because oftentimes, you will find yourself in a meeting where you might not feel empowered to say, hey, that campaign might not go well. Whenever a brand has one of those major backlash moments, the first thing I always ask is who was in the room who did not feel empowered to speak the truth, who did not feel like they would have backup if they spoke the truth, who felt like there would be consequences from them speaking the truth. There's usually one person in that room who's like, ooh, that's not gonna go well. But that person does not feel like they're in a position of power to challenge what's happening. And then we're expecting growth and we're expecting to do great things, but we don't want to be challenged and be uncomfortable. And then we're wondering, oh my God, how did the ball drop? The ball dropped because you foster an environment in your company where if somebody gets challenged, they immediately run to HR. And they're like, oh my gosh, I felt accosted in this meeting. No, when I told you the idea was not the best it could possibly be, that is not an accostation on your personhood. Again, when people ask, we don't know how to create these inclusive environments where our team is gonna feel safe. I'm always like, look at what is happening when the people who are on the team who don't have the power, when the interns, when the women, when the people of color, when the people who are in any marginalized group somehow get consequences for challenging what is happening that is not okay, your company will never grow to be the best version of itself because those people are gonna then get more quiet. And you'll wonder why the bad campaign happened. And you'll wonder why the stakeholders aren't happy. It's because the people who can make the company the best version of itself have been silenced.
Boy, is that a tee up for Tag You're It, Ranya. I mean, Ranya, you were in the room. You get a chance to sit in the room in P&G, one of the biggest companies, one of the most well-respected companies. So shifting mindsets at work to reach inclusive progress. When looking at a global company like P&G, how does that room look? And are you empowered in that room?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. I'll get to your question in 1 second, but because I was here last year, I wanted to just take a moment to thank the Women's Forum and the wonderful organizers of this event. It's now become a yearly no-miss rendezvous for many of us, I think, to progress in the journey for a more inclusive world. And I just think that's great. And I'm particularly honored to participate in this panel because often when we talk about gender equality, we focus very much on institutions, policies, all the mind part, the brain part. But we know that to change behavior, you need to bring in people, behaviors, mind, and heart. And otherwise, nothing will change. That's really the foundation of changing behavior. So now your question is to P&G. And how does this work in P&G? How do we bring it to life? I think it first starts with declaring clearly what we want to achieve. What is our mission? The mission that we've declared is that we want to live, work in a world that's free of gender bias, where not only we have equal representation, but we have an equal voice, where everybody can contribute to their own potential, to their full potential. And we call that a world where we all see equal. And of course, we have targets for gender representation across the levels. We track those, and we're proud, we're making good progress. But again, this is the brain part. What we know is we know that the only way to achieve progress is to create, as you said, an inclusive culture where people can express themselves freely. So how does one create this inclusive culture? The choice that we've made is to focus very much on removing unconscious biases. These are true to the human condition, so we have to acknowledge that they exist, but they limit human potential. And what we try to do is we try to spark a conversation, an honest conversation about what these biases are, and try to focus not on what divides us, but what brings us together and what we have in common. And we have a lot of tools to do that. One of the examples that I wanted to mention is actually an external training, so it's an organization that we partner with. And it's called MARC, Men Advocating for Real Change. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And it is men, you know, because we do want to invite men, and I'm happy to have Michael in the panel and many men in this room. And what is MARC about? So MARC is about recognizing what your biases are, and also recognizes what privileges you have and how not to abuse those privileges. A big part of our leadership team...
You mean white male privilege does really exist?
Any privilege, any privilege. And we've started this training with our leadership teams, because that's very, very important, is to start with the people who mentor the younger generations, the people who role model for the younger generations. And as we recognize those biases, as we recognize those privileges, that affects our behavior. So I've attended MARC twice, actually, and not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I did it with different teams that I'm working with. And I've seen my behavior change, I've seen my colleagues' behavior change. And again, it sounds all theoretical, but it's really small gestures when we talk about opening hearts. It's small gestures in everyday work. So for example, be conscious of when you're talking in a meeting, how long you're talking. How often are you inviting other people to express themselves? Haven't we all been in a situation where you want to contribute, but the other person just going on and on and on and on? So inviting the conversation, making it comfortable for people to contribute, or something as simple as you're running a meeting, you end it on time for parents to go and pick up their children. So again, there's the brain, but then there's the heart, there's being, and I think for me it's a matter of IQ and EQ. We really need to tap into our emotional intelligence to bring people in, to be inclusive, and to open our hearts. So that's the way we live it in P&G, and that's what we would like to keep progressing on.
You know, thank you. We'll give you a clap there. Ranya, when we talk about diversity, we talk racial diversity, we talk gender diversity, but there's diversity as it relates to sexual orientation, including those who are differently abled or disabled, including veterans. Diversity can be a larger pie, and I always say that more people at the table, the better. So you've talked about how P&G deals with it internally. How do you apply that to your brands so that the brands then help affect behaviors when it comes to diversity?
I think that our brands have a huge role to play, because we have very big brands that appeal to a very large number of people. But
You've done feminine care and baby care. That just like across the board.
Yes, I've done a lot of other things before, but more recently I've done feminine care and baby care. But these brands have a very powerful voice in the media. We're one of the largest advertisers worldwide, and we're very conscious of the responsibility that we have. So it's very important that our communication portrays life as it is, and not sticking to some stereotypes from the past, or not even confirming those stereotypes. I'll give just an example on baby care, and then I want to talk about the category from my past life. So on baby care, we've made a conscious choice to bring to life situations that are more representative of what's out there. For example, we've dialed up the role of the dad. That is increasingly important, of course, in addition to the very important role of the mom, but the reality today is that dads are taking a very, very active role in raising their children. We have had partnership with same-sex couples. This is the way that we would like to portray our brands, because by portraying these situations, we're normalizing them and we're tackling all the unconscious biases that are out there. Now, I don't think that communication is enough. I think that brands have to do more to make a real difference in our journey. And here I'll just turn to the topic of gender equality, and I'll talk about a business that I'm not on right now, but that's close to my heart. First, because I'm a woman, And second, because I'm a mom of a teenage girl, and that's the feminine care business. So when I was here last year, those of you who were here may remember that I talked about the Like a Girl campaign. And that campaign was designed to address the drop in self-confidence that young girls have when they have their first period. And so we chose to tackle the stereotypes about what a girl should do and what she doesn't do. And I showed the film last year, and we've received amazing feedback on the film. Now, we've been talking and trying to understand these girls across the world for many years. And one of the things that we know about is that in many parts of the world, girls miss school because they have their period, because they cannot access sanitary products. And we have programs across the world, school programs, we have humanitarian efforts where we've managed so far to donate more than 80 million pads in the last 10 years to help girls not miss a day of school, because I think everybody agrees that no girl should ever miss school because she's a girl. Now, more recently, we found out that actually this is not a developing world problem. Girls are missing school in places like North America, in places like the UK, in Europe. And so we've just launched our End Period Poverty program. It's live in North America, it's live in some parts of Europe. And our pledge is to donate an additional 30 million pads for those girls to help them access sanitary protection. And I think by doing that, we're also sparking a conversation about what sets girls apart from boys, because again, having your period is one of those daily things, but it's something very visible when a girl has to miss school because she has her period, and that should not happen. So
you didn't bring us anything to see this time?
I did. I showed last year. I brought you. No, I mean, I brought the film because this is not just about a pad. This is about what it means for a girl to miss school. So I'd love to show it to you.
Go right ahead.
School is full of lessons, and when you miss a day, more than maths is missed. It's friendship missed, confidence missed, discovering you can be anything you want missed, learning what you love missed. Girls who can't afford protection should never have to give this up, because school is full of lessons, and this shouldn't be missed.
Together we can help end period poverty. Now, when you buy Always Protection, we give product to keep girls in school, always.
Thank you, Ranya. And you teed off right for Michael to jump right in when we started to talk about what role men play in all this. Sir?
Yes. You know, one of the things when we talk about opening hearts, opening minds, I guess the question comes up, how do we open men's minds? How do we engage men and boys to embrace the gender equality revolution? And I think to do that, we have to start by understanding the very paradoxical reality of men within a male-dominated society. It starts, of course, with power. It starts with privilege. It starts with entitlement. It starts with all those things that women have been talking about, writing about, leading the way forward over the years. The strange thing, the paradox for men within that is this. The very ways that we have constructed masculinity in our male-dominated cultures paradoxically comes with all sorts of costs to men ourselves. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not a men's rights activist who says men are the real victims. Not at all.
Oh, you don't want to get beat up at this stage.
Yeah, exactly. But as a pro-feminist man, trying to figure out how we can engage men to work to end violence against women, to do 1/2 of the care work on the planet, we have to figure out the reality of men's lives. And here's the strange paradox. Men live their lives in fear. The ways we've constructed masculinity is based on a high degree of fear about not being a real man. Am I going to be tough enough, smart enough, make enough money, have enough sex, be ripped enough, all these different things enough? And of course, none of us can live up to those expectations of manhood. I mean, I do, but most other men don't. You know, so this is a problem. So what some men do is to prove themselves as men to other men, to women, but particularly to themselves. They will use violence. They will use abuse. They will use harassment. And they will use those as tools And those tools are, you could say, needed out of this basically crappy ways we've defined and codified men's power. What that means for me is that when we talk about engaging men, we have to start with feminism. And we have to say to men, feminism is the greatest gift that men have ever had. And it's the greatest gift that we have ever had because it allows us to envision a world of equality, of justice, of healthier relationships, healthier workplaces, stronger workplaces, but it also allows us to envision a life as men that are freed from these narrow constraints of being a real man, which is just destructive. But to achieve that, to achieve those changes, to engage men, to think about the inclusivity. You know, we talk about inclusive cultures as you did. Inclusive cultures require inclusive leaderships. So we need those transformations on the levels of leadership. To shift minds, we often just think, oh yeah, we're just going to shift your mind and your mind and your mind. And when we shift a whole bunch of minds, we've changed society. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And that's why we need social movements. That's why the women's movement has changed the world, because it's organized as a movement to bring about changes in policy. In the last panel, we heard about some of the changes taking place in Iceland, for example, where we see a huge increase in men doing care work. Huge increase. Why did that happen? It's not just because all sorts of Icelandic men sat around, all of a sudden going, hey, I've got a great idea, let's do half the care work. It was because of the pressure of women in relationships, but most profoundly it was because of policy changes at the government level said, this is what we need to do to create an enabling environment. So within those environments, at the corporate level, at the government level, then what we do is we can inspire, we can challenge, we can make possible that individual change. Let's not forget one of the brilliant early slogans of the women's movement. I guess I'm dating myself here, but when we talked, it was the personal is political. And thinking of that combination, of course what that meant is that our personal relationships are political, not just in the sense of who you vote for, but they're political in the sense they're about relations of power. And those relations of power come in, as you've all been talking about, they come right into our workplaces. They come right into our bedrooms. They come right into our kitchens and homes and into our nurseries and so forth. And what we need to do is to find ways to reach out to men with positive messages, for me to say to my brothers, we can be part of this. We can be part of this out of love and caring for the women in our lives. We can be part of this because it's going to strengthen our communities. It's going to strengthen our families. Let's take back all the rhetoric of the family from the right wing, because feminism is going to strengthen our families, because a strong family is an equal family, is a nurturing family where nurturing is shared. But also to say to men, this is making our lives better. And so bringing together both that level of change in policy with a compassionate challenge to personal change. Not I'm throwing my brothers up against the wall and you better change or else. But to reaching out to my brothers with compassion and saying, we can embrace this change. It's going to be better for all of us.
Michael, it sounds like you're saying that the approach, the way we actually approach the division can impact on our behaviors for changing it.
I think that's so true, and Alexis is going to speak next, and she does work with a neuroscience institute, but we know we respond differently if we're being pushed up against a wall and if we're being embraced. And, if once we embrace, there was this wonderful, some of you may remember in your studies, that Swiss psychologist, Piaget, who talked about the nurturing environment in which children learn. Well, it's the same nurturing environment which we all learn. If we feel safe, if we feel supported, if we feel we belong, our brains actually can work better. We can actually make the connections we need to learn and to change. And so what that means in relation to men is that absolutely, men need to be challenged. We need, men need our sisters to challenge us. Just like as someone with white skin, I need to be challenged with the realities of racism. As a guy who's straight, I need to be challenged about the realities of the privilege I carry as a straight guy. But that challenge can be an embracing, welcoming, loving challenge. To say, here, see a bit of my world. I want to share my world with you. And I want to challenge you to understand, to listen, just to listen for a minute. And by doing that, what we're doing together is creating a world that is getting beyond this I mean, let's think about it. Let me just interrupt myself. Who is benefiting from polarization? It's the fear mongers, it's the hate mongers, and they do it way better than any of us could ever do. They are good at it. And one of the things that we've got to do, and it sounds really corny, but it's so true, when we talk about a theme like this, hearts and minds, how do we unite this? And folks, it's 4 letters in English, it's love. It's bringing together that compassion, that nurturing. And that's one reason why the theme of men, we've heard this about doing half of the care work on the planet is critical. Because the key skill you need to look after a baby is empathy, is to feel what someone else feels because they can't tell you what they feel. And so as we bring men into that care work, as we transform masculinity, we do it in response to the demands, to the needs, to the interests of women. We do it within an environment that is not just tolerant, I hate that word tolerant, but is welcoming, that is celebratory of our differences, of our diversities, knowing that strengthens our companies, it strengthens our communities, it strengthens our lives.
Thank you, Michael. And you teed up Alexis perfectly. Actually, there's a big difference, Alexis, between explicit bias and unconscious bias. Sadly, we experienced some explicit bias last night at a restaurant. Let me, Louis, so you can write that down. Straight racism, just straight racism. I'm not sure that I'd ever experienced it in my face from not just the staff, but from the people in the restaurant. I knew how to deal with explicit bias. I'm not sure how to deal with unconscious bias.
Yes. Last night was something.
Yes.
But very glad to be here and to be with this community and friends to be able to talk about it and talk about the fact that we do have a muscle when we see explicit bias, right? We have a muscle when someone walks into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shoots 9 parishioners, when someone does the same thing in a synagogue in Pittsburgh just recently, when we have things like the Muslim ban, and I know these are largely US-centric, but we know these experiences of hate are happening across the world, and that explicit, like that reaction, right, just even naming those things, you feel it inside, right? You have a visceral reaction to it. We have a reaction when there's kind of like the preponderance of evidence, right?
Yes.
When you see, story after story of women experiencing sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, or racial harassment and discrimination, you start to believe that there's a pattern of discrimination, understand how to these are not isolated incidents. But the unconscious process, right, is a little bit harder to reconcile because while, and I'm going to push back a little bit on the focus on unconscious bias, because in some ways it's become a silver bullet, right? We can accept the fact that we have biases, and biases are essentially what make us human. It's how our brains have evolved, but yet it doesn't do enough to talk about how we interact with each other. Just telling you have bias is not enough. I'm going to talk about one other concept. Before I do it, I want to level set you guys up for a end of the day exercise. It requires group participation. All good? Okay, can you bring up my slides? Okay, great. Our unconscious networks. So I know some people, I know we all are obviously listening to this in English. Some of you are French speakers, so we're going to try to do it for both of you. I'm going to give you what's called a Stroop Test. Can you all see that word on the screen? Okay, I want you to state the color of the text, okay? So let's try it all together.
Blue.
Okay, the color of the text. And I'm going to go a little bit faster. Ready? Go.
Red, green, black, green, red, blue, black, black, blue, red.
What happened?
Blue, green.
Wait, what happened? Here we are. You guys were so fantastic. Where did it get hard?
We're doing diversity and inclusion, and we just screwed it all up.
Yeah, exactly. You don't even know the basic colors in the words. So where did it get hard? Just for a short time, I'm gonna try it for those of us who speak French, because you may have been able to do it a little bit faster. In français, s'il vous plaît. Okay, state the color of the word. Ready? Go. So what happened there? What happened in both of these slides? They're exactly the same in the words, but I do want to give you a chance to do it one more time once I explain it, because I think it's really important. What happened is that, you know, ever since we learned letters, ever since we learned that letters strung together actually create words, there's meaning inside of them. And so when we see that, our brain automatically overrides us, even though you were engaging in a task to state the color, your brain just completely overrode you because it wanted to read the word, it wanted to figure out what the meaning was. And when it became, we call schema inconsistent, it became harder to do. Our brains process 11 million bits of information unconsciously in the same amount of time that we process about 10 to 40 bits of information consciously. So we have to create these schemas just to navigate. But it doesn't mean that we're at the mercy of our automatic brain. So let me just do this one more time because I want to just add that other concept for you, which is just to explore the level of anxiety that we're experiencing when we do this. So now do it last time. You see it's the same slide. Go.
Blue, red, green, black, green, black, red, green, red, blue, black, green, green, red, blue.
Okay, give yourselves a round of applause. Because that was quick learning, and it means that we don't have to be at the mercy of our automatic brain. It means
Alexis, we were focused. We were really focused on
So what
it.
changed? How did you focus? What changed for you?
I didn't want to be wrong.
Fear of not being wrong.
Yes.
You slowed down.
Slowed down,
You
and
slowed
I thought
down,
about it.
And you thought about it, and you knew essentially what the schema was that you were worried about trying to break.
Right.
So this is a Stroop test. It was invented in 1935. It has nothing to do with, Dr. Stroop did not invent this to talk about race or gender, but it's so helpful for understanding how quickly it is that we make these automatic assumptions, right? Beyond that, it also helps us understand the anxiety that we have when we're confronting it, not wanting to be right. And when we talk about, particularly in this time, around, and I'll stay with just racial and gender anxiety, although they're the multiple social identities which intersect, that's also a physiological response. It's also our bodies telling us something about how we interact with each other that's a challenge. So when you have two people in a cross-racial group or a cross-gendered group, the person who is a member of the in-group, or the out-group rather, may worry that discrimination may be coming towards it. So as a woman of color, I'm interacting, I'm always worried a little bit that, there may be some level of discrimination coming towards me, and then yet I'm also worried, the person on the other side of the equation may be worried that there may be some level of, if I say the wrong thing, it's going to land in the wrong way. And that creates essentially two executive brains going into fight or flight mode. And it makes it harder for us to interact. Part of what I think we need to really challenge here is that the science is really, really helpful, but the science in terms of just explaining these automatic interactions, what it really does is it helps us unpack why this paradox that we talk about at Perception, which is this fairness paradox, why is it that we can believe ourselves to be so fair and yet see such disparate outcomes? And our argument is that we've actually been taught to practice fairness incorrectly, right? It's not that we're not fair, we're not trying to be fair, but we think that we've been taught to practice fairness incorrectly. Part of that is the color blindness that Luvvie talked about, or the gender blindness. Some of it has been just believing we can be fully objective and that we don't have these blind spots when, that these stereotypes that seep into our brain when we interact with people. And a huge part of it is believing that we actually are trying to create meritocracies, right? These are things, when they interact together, and you look at the layer of the science under it, you recognize that they're great aspirations, but in practice it's really challenging to do.
And to bring in everyone, we've sort of acknowledged that there are personal masks that we wear every day, as well as professional masks. It's imperative that we either marry those or acknowledge them. Luvvie, you touched on it initially when you first spoke, but I'd like to explore how one puts their personal and professional mask on at the same time.
I feel like my whole career has been me putting on my personal and professional at the same time, but it's because when I started when I started blogging, back then it wasn't a career, so I didn't have the pressure of thinking about it as this is me being professional. I thought it was just me being myself. And the gift of that is that back then with no expectations, you can be yourself. There was no idea of professional mask as a blogger because you weren't considered a professional. But it really honed the idea in me that the way I can do my best work is if I don't feel like I am wearing any masks. Because then I don't have to think twice. I can give all my brain to doing the excellence of the work as opposed to being like, here's half my brain to figuring out how I show up to make sure it's palatable to the room, and here's the other half to make sure the work is good. So I make sure that in whatever room I'm in, no matter if I was emceeing a conference where I was one of 2 black people in a room of 400, and I happened to be the MC of the whole conference. So I insisted on wearing a Lionel Richie t-shirt that said, "Hello, is it me you're looking for?" Because I want people to get used to seeing folks showing up fully as themselves. Like, of course, sometimes we code switch based on the rooms we're in, but minimizing that, I need people to get used to seeing this in all of the glory and not being shocked by it. Because then they're so used to the mask that everybody wears all the time, and because a lot of times we have to wear it because of the unconscious bias of making sure, oh my God, I'm suited and booted all the time. Sometimes I will make it a point to dress down at a conference. Because I'm like, everyone is in business casual, we're being asked to wear business casual. What happens if I show up in a pair of high tops? It does not make my work less excellent when I take that stage. So I want us to start taking less of the professional mask on and just showing up as ourselves. Because when everybody gets used to you being you in all of your dopeness, then it stops being like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Let's just do it.
Michael, how does, Luvvie points it out, she shows up as her authentic self. Are you able to show up as your authentic male white self in a room filled with women and not feel the wall so that anything you say or do is not misinterpreted? Do you know what I'm asking you?
I mean, I think on some levels it's a challenge. I mean, for me, what was really important when I started doing this work back in the 1980s is I did a lot of counseling, I did a lot of work in sort of men's sort of support groups, and just learned to talk about my own life as a man and face up to things. And so now, I mean, when I give talks, I tell a lot of stories and so on, and some of them are personal stories, but I can now say things to a group that I wouldn't have said to my best friend 40 years ago. Because I think part is that living in fear of how we will present ourselves as men. I think there are things that we all do in terms of as professionals and as social change activists that you choose your battles, you choose what you say, you choose what you talk about. But I guess that's different. That's not being inauthentic. That's just making choices. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I grew up with 4 sisters, and I'm kind of used to this actually. Yeah. But I think here's the interesting thing. I think there's a lot of men who, and I don't mean men who are sort of dealing with these issues, but I think there are many men in the world who have felt more comfortable talking to women about their lives and their vulnerabilities. Because women know that. Women have been able to see through men's mask, that collective mask that we put on. And I think some of the biggest fear among men is with other men. We have all these elaborate societies of male bonding. The locker room, the Vatican, the boardroom, and they're really places where we sort of negotiate the rules among men because men are terrified. And I think many men have found safety among women. Now the problem with that, for some men who have found that safety, and then it becomes then the space where all sorts of crap can come out. Where violence can come out and hatred can come out. So obviously that's not where we're going. But I think in many cases, men have felt that safety with women. And I guess maybe it's partly because, having a loving mother and father, but also 4 sisters, it was the environment I grew up in.
So this feels comfortable.
Oh, I love it.
This feels comfortable. Ranya, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, as someone who sits at the table making these decisions, do you ever feel pressure that you have to be that person Luvvie's described, that's sitting at the table, because you know the responsibility is going to rest on your shoulders, and one of the people in this audience on this stage is going to say, well, Ranya was in the room when they made that decision. How did that happen?
I couldn't agree more with what you said. I think that we have to be ourselves, and we have to lead with the heart. this is the only way to lead effectively. You know, I was earlier doing the mentoring session, and I get asked a lot by younger people in the company to give advice. And one of the most recurrent questions that I get is, I have this passion, but I understand career is very important, so I want to drop this and just focus on my career. And what I always say is, the only way to be successful in your career is to do something that you're passionate about and to bring your heart into it. Otherwise, if you force yourself into someone you're not, or into half of what you are, you'll never be able to do a great job. So for me, there is no reconciliation. We have to lead with both heart and mind.
So the only way to open hearts and close divides is to be your authentic self and bring it to the table at all times.
Be genuine, be yourself. And that's something that everybody will appreciate.
Alexis, how does one tamp down the anxiety around doing that?
Right. I'm going to address like one thing that Ranya said and
course.
come back to this, which is that there's also a market, there's a corporate cost to the burden. It's called a cognitive burden that we are carrying when we walk into a room where our identity is so salient, and it becomes so hard because we're doing that. We're half of our brain is going towards managing how other people perceive us, and the other half of the brain, you know, so to speak, is trying to stay focused on the task. And so when you're not getting the best out of the people that you're working with, you're not able to bring the best self out of that work because you're focused on trying to navigate those identities, because it has real life consequences when you don't. And we see that in every sector. It's not just in the corporate sector. We see that in the social sector. We see that in the healthcare sector. And so it becomes really, really important for us to, you know, for people who employ people to think about how to lift up, recognize where that cost is doing for your bottom line, because you don't have everybody going in ready to just crush it. And that, I think, is a huge challenge. The anxiety piece, actually just having a name for it, just like most therapists will tell you, just having a name for it actually helps us reduce anxiety a little bit, knowing that there is actually such a thing as racial anxiety. It's not your brain. It's not actually calling you racist. It's not calling you sexist to have gender anxiety. It's just the fact that it's how we've been taught to interact with each other. If I've been told over and over again that I'm no longer allowed to notice race, or I'm no longer allowed to notice her gender, then every time I notice it, my brain is going to get exhausted. It's like when I say I'm going to give up sugar, you know, for Lent, and like then I land in Charles de Gaulle Airport and I see all these beautiful, chocolateries and pastry shops, and I just I want to lose my mind because your brain continues to go. And so naming it and being able to come up with a structured policy around how to address it so people don't lean into their biases is actually what's really important.
How do stereotypes actually influence our perceptions? Anyone? Ranya? How do stereotypes influence our perceptions?
I think we see the world through the filter that we all individually have. This is the notion of stereotype, the notion of unconscious bias, and they obviously influence the decisions that we take because it's a filter. So the more, as you were saying, the more I loved, by the way, the color game. The more we recognize them, and the more we think about them, the better we are at taking decisions, but also at working with other people and recognizing what their biases are and what are the stereotypes that they have in mind.
Luvvie, are we more genuine in addressing some kinds of stereotypes rather than, and not all?
Absolutely. I think one of the ones, when we talk about stereotypes, we talk about racial stereotypes a lot. And, we'll be a little bit more authentic than when we're talking about gender-based stereotypes and sexual orientation stereotypes. We don't really talk about LGBTQ issues as openly as we talk about race, which is interesting because both of them are marginalized. Like, you marginalize black people, brown people around the world. You also marginalize gay and trans people. But the conversation that happens more is around the race because that's what we've heard more about. That's what is more focused on. So I think it is one of those learning curves where we got to create more safe spaces and allow more people to ask questions, because I think we're also at a point now where people are being penalized for asking questions. So how do we grow when we don't have the space and the room to challenge and ask these questions where it's actually for clear understanding as opposed to further marginalizing people? That is where the whole getting comfortable with the whole discomfort thing comes in handy. We're so afraid of discomfort. We think nobody dies from discomfort, first of all. If you have to make a room uncomfortable for 5 minutes, make it uncomfortable for 5 minutes. If you want to ask a question that's going to allow you or somebody else in that room to grow and know more than when you walked in, make the room uncomfortable. We're so afraid of discomfort that we'll sit there and take we'll take comfort over justice any day. And then we wonder why the world is burning. Well, we got too comfortable.
You know,
What I just wanted to add quickly to that is when you are anxious, you want to focus so much on managing your own anxiety that you can actually deny somebody the opportunity when you do that, right? We can get so focused on managing our own anxiety that we forget that there's someone else who may not get the promotion or may not get invested in or may not whatever because we feel uncomfortable engaging in it. So thinking about the cost there too is important.
Michael?
You know, Star, your question, and I realize my answer was sort of glib, I feel comfortable, and that's true. But I think what's most important, as I thought afterwards, was, and it goes back to what you're saying, is that, you know, to open hearts, we've got to open our ears first. We have to listen. And so for me, what is so important when I attend is I do a lot of gatherings where there's disproportionate numbers of women. For me, it's like, you know, a chance to like read a diary that someone else has written. You know, when I hear you say a story and I want to, you know, last night I experienced outright racism. I want to hear that. And I don't mean, you know, it's not the prurient, it's like, just to give us all a chance to get beyond our own, not just our own world, but our own sense of privilege. I mean, when you live, for those of us who have relative privilege because of our sex, because of our skin color, because of our sexual orientation, because of our religion, the thing about privilege is invisible to you. The privileges we carry are invisible. And so in a meeting like this, for me as a man, speaking to people of color as a white person, and so forth, what it does, it's like reading this precious diary. And so to be challenged, as you say, to allow ourselves to feel uncomfortable is so important because it allows us then to take the next step.
Excellent. I want to also make an extra point about when we're talking about these tough times and we're in these rooms. A lot of times people in marginalized groups have to take on the extra emotional labor to educate the people in the room who have privilege, and that is exhausting.
Right.
So as somebody who has privilege, I think it is important for you to go out of your own way to not start at point A and expect somebody to bring you to point Z. You start at T because you've already read up, you've heard stories from people, you've actually done the work. So when we talk about privilege and we talk about people actually doing something about their privilege, one way you can do this is making sure that you are spending your privilege. It's a concept, not just not weaponizing your privilege, but actually using your privilege to allow somebody else who's marginalized to come a little bit further so they can become closer to you.
I see Sophie lurking, which means I'm going to have to wrap up. Before I can wrap up, though, I do have to get my action item, because that is what I have been told we must get. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I take instructions. The final thought, because every panel, every plenary, we want to walk away with something. So what's the one thing that you can do to open hearts and close divides?
Should I go?
Yes.
So I have to be careful what I wish for, because last year I wished for more men coming to this forum. And this year we have Michael with us and we have more men. I'm going to keep on wishing on it because I don't think we have half the room with men.
Yes.
So let's hope for more men next year, please. No, I think we've talked a lot that it's a matter of mind and heart. It's a matter of IQ and EQ. And you know what I think we need to do is we need to keep on recognizing is what our biases are, what are those stereotypes in our minds, understand them, not abuse of our privileges, to really, really move forward towards a more inclusive world.
Got it. Michael?
And you know, for the men here, don't take those applause as clapping for us being here. It's about time that we're here. They're clapping for the goal of. So you know, I think for me as a goal is really to continue to try to find ways to bring these ideas right into the mainstream. We're up against a period of incredible vicious hate right now, vicious extremism of different sorts that are trying to turn back the clock on gender justice, turning back the clock, fighting against racism and intolerance. And so one of the things for me, I think that is critical for us is to really collectively and individually think how we can individually both bridge different gaps, reach out to people we don't normally reach out to people we don't feel comfortable with, reach out to people we feel maybe a bit scared of, and figure out how we can find common cause and how we can, and which will be the effective way of marginalizing these incredibly vicious hate mongers that we're all up against now.
Thank you, Michael. Alexis?
I think for too long we've relied on just our goodwill and our willpower to try to fight these biases, to fight these the stereotypes, and that we believe ourselves to be so good. I think we have to interrogate our assumptions around how we practice that goodness. And sometimes the way we think we're practicing it is not the way that someone wants to be affirmed. And if you believe that you're affirming humanity and yet you are not actually seeing the person, the whole person, for not just their kind of social group, but also their very important individual qualities that make them who they are, then we're missing out. And that's a practice. It's a practice called individuation that we have to really get a lot stronger at doing.
Got it. And Luvvie?
And what I will keep doing is using my big platform to talk about these issues, to bring the difficult in and allow people to really understand different ideas, different perspectives. And I just keep calling people out for being ridiculous. I think that's important, being the side-eye sorcerers. And half the world needs to know, like, it's ridiculous. And once we know what the problem is, then we can fix it.
I thank you very much. I'd like to add, a friend of mine once said, and I love it, it sits in my heart at all time, when you have a seat at the table, scooch over and make room for somebody else sitting next to you, and that person does not necessarily need to look like you, sound like you, come from your same orientation, religion, race, or anything else. Thank you all very, very, very much.
Thank you.